The moment my husband's attorney read the clause out loud, the entire room went silent. Not polite courtroom quiet, the kind of silence that happens when someone realizes they've walked into a trap they built themselves. My husband looked at me from across that conference table, and I watched 15 years of arrogance drain out of his face in about 4 seconds. I almost felt bad for him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up because none of this makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning starts with a girl who thought love was enough to build a life on. I'm Priya. I'm 32 years old, and until 8 months ago, I was married to a man named Cole Whitfield. 12 years together, 9 of them married. We met in college. He was in his second year of business school. I was finishing my undergrad in accounting. He had this energy about him, this absolute certainty that he was going to build something great. Half the people I knew found it annoying. I found it magnetic. I was 20 years old. Cut me some slack. We got married right after I passed my CPA exam. I remember thinking that was its own kind of symbol. I was becoming someone who could stand on her own 2 feet, and I was choosing to walk beside him anyway. My mother cried at the wedding. My grandmother squeezed my hand at the reception and said very quietly, "Keep your own account, sweetheart." I smiled and thought she was being old fashioned. I think about that a lot now. Code's company, with few renovations, was 2 employees and a pickup truck when we married. By year 4, it had grown into a mid-sized residential contracting firm in the Charlotte area. 15 full-time staff, a solid reputation, contracts with several new development communities. He was good at sales and vision. I was good at everything else. I handled the books, managed vendor relationships, filed quarterly taxes, coordinated subcontractors, wrote proposals, and somewhere in there also made dinner and remembered when his mother's birthday was. My official title was his wife. My actual title was whatever he needed that day. I didn't mind at first. It was our company, our future, our thing we were building together. I believed that completely. For years I believed it. The cracks started showing around year 7. He stopped asking my opinion on bids, started making hiring decisions without telling me. Got a little short when I raised concerns about cash flow. "You handle the numbers, I handle the vision," he'd say, like those were two separate things that didn't talk to each other. He started going to industry dinners I wasn't invited to, started coming home later, started looking at me like I was a piece of furniture that had been in the same corner for too long. I noticed. I just didn't know what I was noticing yet. Then, 11 months ago, my husband sat me down at our kitchen table on a Wednesday night. He was calm. Not sad calm, not nervous calm. Calm the way people get when they've rehearsed something many times. He said he wanted a divorce. He said he'd already spoken to an attorney. He said he wanted to keep the house, the business, the accounts. He said I could have the contents of my personal checking account and whatever was in my car. He said it like he was reading from a document. Maybe he was. I sat there for a long moment. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I remember thinking that was such a stupid thing to notice. The refrigerator, while my marriage was ending. But the brain does what the brain does. I said, "Okay." He blinked. He'd clearly expected a fight. "Okay, okay," I said again. "Let's get the process started." I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. What Cole didn't know, what I hadn't told a single person, was that 8 months earlier, I'd found something in the company's financial records that had changed everything. It was a Tuesday night in February, the kind of cold that makes Charlotte feel like a different city. Cole was at a client dinner. I was reconciling the Q4 accounts, something I did every quarter without being asked, because somebody had to. I was going through the equipment lease files when I noticed a discrepancy, a double billing. Not a big one, about $4,200, but wrong is wrong, and I followed it back. That thread unraveled for the next 4 hours. What I found wasn't an accident. What I found was a pattern of deliberate financial misrepresentation that had been running for at least 3 years. Cole had been inflating project costs on commercial contracts, overbilling clients by routing payments through a shell company he'd set up under a variation of his middle name. The money was going into an account I'd never seen before. By my calculation, based on the records I had access to, the amount was somewhere between $340,000 and $400,000 over 3 years. I sat in my home office at 2 in the morning, surrounded by printouts, and felt the floor shift under me. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't carelessness. This was fraud. Ongoing, deliberate, carefully structured fraud. And the contracts he'd been overbilling, most of them were commercial clients, property management companies, a couple of small businesses, one county municipal project. The county one. That one made my stomach drop. If the county contract involved fraud, this wasn't just a civil matter, this was potentially federal. My first instinct was to call him, confront him that night, demand an explanation, give him the chance to tell me I was misreading everything. But I'd been married to Cole for 9 years. I knew exactly what would happen. He'd minimize it, he'd explain it. He'd turn it around somehow until I was the unreasonable one for even questioning him. And then he'd be very, very careful about what I had access to. So I didn't say a word. Instead, I made copies of everything I could access. I backed up the relevant files to an encrypted external drive. I made paper copies and put them in a safety deposit box at a bank branch across town, one Cole had never been to, under my maiden name. I took photos of the paper copies with my phone as a third backup. And then I kept going to work every day, cooking dinner, asking how his meetings went, and waiting. I want to be honest about something. Those 8 months were the strangest of my life. I knew what I knew. I kept going through the motions. Some mornings I'd be making coffee and look at Cole across the kitchen and feel like I was watching someone through a window, like the glass between us had always been there and I just never noticed it before. I want to be clear about why I waited instead of acting immediately. I was scared, not of Cole personally, but of the situation. I'd done enough accounting work to understand that when you find evidence of fraud and you're the one who has access to the books, you need to be very careful about how you handle it. If I surface this information wrong, I could accidentally implicate myself. I needed advice from someone who understood both the legal and financial dimensions, and I needed to get it without tipping Cole off. I quietly retained an attorney, not a divorce attorney, a white collar defense attorney, and explained what I'd found. She reviewed the documents, she confirmed my read. She also told me something I hadn't fully considered. As Cole's spouse with access to the company books, I had potential exposure if regulators came looking. The advice was unambiguous. I needed to get ahead of this. We talked through options for weeks. By the time Cole told me he wanted a divorce, I had already spent months in quiet preparation. I knew what the company was actually worth. I knew what it owed. I knew what was hidden. And I knew that the moment Cole assumed full ownership of that business, he was assuming everything that came with it. So when he told me he wanted the house and the company and everything, I said, okay, because okay was the only word that made sense. I found out about the woman 3 weeks later. Her name was Tatum, according to the tag on the bag she left in my front hallway when she came to drop off some paperwork for Cole. Late 20s, I'd guess. She had the look of someone who had never once questioned whether she deserved things. Cole introduced her to me in my own living room with the energy of a man who had convinced himself this was normal. He actually said, "This is Tatum. She's been a real support through everything." I said, "Nice to meet you," and went to make a cup of tea because I didn't trust myself to say anything else. She used my good towels. I know because I found them folded differently. Cole's mother arrived the following weekend. Her name is Ramona Whitfield, and she has spent 12 years making it gently clear that his son had married beneath him. She arrived with a casserole and a list of opinions about what I was entitled to take when I moved out. She walked through my house with the energy of a woman conducting an inventory. This was a wedding gift to Cole, she said about the coffee maker, which we bought at Target 2 years into our marriage. This has always been a family piece, she said about an end table I'd found at an estate sale. She put my grandmother's quilt, which had been in my family for 3 generations, in a stack of things she deemed marital property subject to division. I picked it up and moved it to my car without a word. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from being erased by people who smile while they're doing it. It doesn't announce itself, it seeps. The person I thought was on my side was my closest friend from college. A woman I'll call my college roommate, because even now I find it hard to say her name with any neutrality. We'd been close for 12 years. She was the first person I called the night Cole told me he wanted a divorce. She was so supportive. Called and texted every few days, brought wine, let me cry, told me Cole was making an enormous mistake. It took me about 6 weeks to notice the pattern. I'd mentioned something to her, a concern about the timeline, a thought about which attorney to use, and somehow Cole would reference it before I'd acted on it, not directly, sideways, casually. Enough that eventually I started testing it. I told her I was thinking of hiring a forensic accountant to audit the business. Cole mentioned over text 2 days later that any audit requests would be contested vigorously. That was enough for me. She wasn't malicious, I don't think. She'd been half in love with my husband for years. In that quiet way, some people carry feelings they've decided are harmless. Cole knew. Men like Cole always know, and they file that information away for when it might be useful. He'd given her enough attention, enough warmth, enough vague implication that she was special to keep her willing. I stopped sharing anything real with her. I kept our conversations friendly and empty. She continued reporting back, I assume, but the information she was passing along was theater. The hardest part of all of it wasn't Cole. It wasn't Ramona. It wasn't even my former friend. It was my daughter. Caitlin is 11. She's sharp and perceptive, and she picks up on things I never told her. She saw her father with Tatum. She watched Ramona march through our house. She noticed that her dad was suddenly very relaxed and her mom was very quiet, and the air in our house had changed in a way she didn't have words for yet. Cole was careful about how he talked to her. He didn't say anything outright. He was more subtle than that. The sighs, the careful little comments about how he just wanted everyone to be okay, the slight weariness whenever Caitlin mentioned something I'd said, planting doubt by inches. I watched my daughter start to fold into herself a little, not angry at me, just uncertain. Looking at me sometimes like she was trying to solve a math problem she didn't have all the variables for. That was the thing that actually broke me open, privately in the shower, where nobody could hear, not the house, not the money. My daughter's uncertainty about whether her mother was the good guy. I hired a family law attorney named Miss Caldwell, early 50s, former prosecutor, the kind of woman who writes notes in the margins of everything and never seems surprised. I told her I wasn't going to fight Cole on the assets. I wanted a clean settlement. I wanted custody arrangements that protected Caitlin. I wanted my name off the business. She looked at me for a long moment. You understand what you're giving up? I said yes. She thought I'd broken. I was the third woman she'd seen that month who was too exhausted to fight. She gave me resources for counseling. She was kind about it. She had no idea. The next 2 months, I became a very good actress. I attended every mediation looking exactly like a woman who had lost. I wore tired clothes. I spoke quietly. I asked for modest things, my personal accounts, shared custody of Caitlin, my grandmother's quilt. I didn't push for business valuation. I didn't contest the house. I said I just wanted to start over. I said I was done fighting. Cole's attorney was a man named Fletcher, and I watched him visibly relax across the table every time I came in, looking like I'd given up. He started cutting the mediation sessions short because, as he once said while gathering his papers, we're basically in agreement already. Meanwhile, Miss Caldwell was doing the actual work in the background. The divorce agreement gave Cole full ownership of Whitfield renovations, all assets, all contracts, all equipment. It also, per standard legal drafting, transferred all associated liabilities, the tax obligations, the vendor disputes, the outstanding equipment loans, and most significantly, full legal exposure for any irregularities in the company's financial history. There was also a separate, quiet process happening on a different track entirely. The documents I'd gathered and the counsel I'd taken from my white collar attorney had led us to a referral. Before the divorce was finalized, I had cooperated, voluntarily and with legal guidance, with a preliminary inquiry regarding the company's billing practices on certain contracts. My attorney had been meticulous about establishing that my role had been limited and that I had no knowledge of the scheme during its operation, which was true and documented. I was protected. Cole would not be. He didn't know any of this when he walked into the final hearing. Cole arrived to the courthouse the way he did everything, like the outcome had already been decided in his favor. Tatum was waiting outside. His mother had come along and was sitting in the gallery with the contained satisfaction of a woman expecting to witness a victory. Cole was in his good suit. He was smiling. Fletcher had done a last-minute review of the full settlement package that morning. He'd raised a question about the liability language in the business transfer section. Cole had waved him off. I built that company, he said. I know what it's worth. The hearing proceeded. The judge, a woman in her late 50s, with the expression of someone who has heard every version of every story, reviewed the terms. She looked at me. Miss Whitfield, you're voluntarily relinquishing your interest in the family home and in the business you helped build over the course of your marriage. I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what you're agreeing to today. I said yes, Your Honor. I understand completely. She looked at me a beat longer than necessary. Then she continued. The documents were distributed. Cole signed everything quickly, the way people sign things when they're not really reading them, when the outcome feels inevitable and they just want the formality to end. Fletcher was reading. And then Fletcher stopped reading. He went back a page, then forward. I watched him go very still in the way that lawyers go still when they're calculating. He leaned toward Cole and spoke quietly. Cole frowned, looked at the page, looked at Fletcher, said, "What?" Fletcher spoke again, lower. Cole's expression changed. Not all at once, it moved through phases, like weather. Confusion first, then a kind of impatience. Then, as Fletcher turned to a specific section and pointed, something harder. Something that looked like the first cold edge of real fear. This isn't, Cole started. The judge lipped up. Mr. Whitfield, she said, is there a problem? Cole looked at the document. He looked at me. I had been sitting quietly with my hands folded on the table, and I kept sitting that way. The liability transfer, Fletcher said carefully. Your Honor, my client may not have fully understood the scope of. Your client signed documents, the judge said. He was represented by counsel. Are you telling me he didn't read them? I advised a full review of the business financials before we finalized, Fletcher said, in the tone of a man beginning to establish a paper trail. My client declined. He produced the acknowledgement, the form Cole had signed 2 months earlier without reading it, confirming that he had been advised to conduct an independent valuation of the business before assuming full ownership and had chosen not to. Cole stared at that form for a long moment. You signed it, the judge said, not unkindly. Just factually, you were advised, you declined. The agreement stands. Cole returned to me. His voice cracked at the edges, not quite anger, not quite disbelief, the sound of someone whose internal story is collapsing faster than they can revise it. You knew, he said, you knew what was in those books. I looked at him across that table. 12 years of marriage, 12 years of making his business run, raising his daughter, believing that what we were building together was actually together. I kept your books for 9 years, Cole. I said, I knew everything. The gavel came down. What happened after that happened fast and slowly at the same time, the way things do when they've been a long time coming. Tatum left him within a month. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she'd found out about the financial situation, specifically about the investigation that was by then no longer preliminary and had made a quiet and efficient exit. I can't blame her. She didn't sign up for what was coming. What was coming arrived in the form of notices, audits, and eventually charges related to the billing fraud on the county contract. I won't detail the specifics here because some of it is still ongoing, but I'll say that Cole's attorneys are now of a different and significantly more expensive variety than Fletcher. Ramona stopped coming around. The last I heard, she was telling people at her church that there must have been a misunderstanding and that Cole was working through some very complicated business challenges. She sent me a text once asking me to speak to Caitlin on his behalf. I showed the text to Caitlin and let her decide. My former friend texted me 3 times after the hearing. The last one said, I genuinely didn't think things were this bad. I'm so sorry. I read it, set my phone down, and went back to what I was doing. Some conversations don't need to happen. Some apologies are more about the person apologizing than the person being apologized to. Caitlin figured things out herself. That's the thing about 11-year-olds who are actually paying attention. They don't need anyone to explain what they've already observed. She watched her father's business fall apart. She watched Tatum leave. She watched her grandmother stop visiting. She came to me one evening while I was unpacking boxes in the smaller house I was renting, a 2 bedroom near her school, very manageable, completely mine, and she sat on the floor next to me. Did you know this was going to happen? She asked. I considered how honest to be. She's 11, not 8. I knew some of it, I said. I was trying to protect us. She was quiet for a minute. Then, is that why you didn't fight him in court? Because you didn't have to? 11 years old. Yeah, I said. That's pretty much it. She leaned her head against my shoulder. She stayed there for a long time. I had a separate account that I'd maintained throughout our marriage. My own IRA from the 3 years I worked at a firm before leaving to run Cole's business, and a savings account in my name alone, built from small contributions over the years because my grandmother's voice had been in the back of my head the whole time. Together they came to about 94,000, not a fortune, enough to start. I also had my CPA license, which I'd kept current even while running his company, because some part of me had always understood that credentials belong to you and business partnerships don't. I went back to work. I started contracting part time with a small accounting firm while Caitlin was at school. Within 6 months, I had 3 steady clients of my own. I was charging what I was worth, which turned out to be considerably more than the $0 I'd been charging for 9 years. Cole came to the rental house once. It was about 4 months after the hearing. He looked like someone who hadn't been sleeping well, which tracked. He stood on the front porch and said he needed to talk. He said he'd made mistakes. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said maybe there was a way we could. What, Cole? I asked. He couldn't say it. Couldn't actually form the request, which I suspect was some version of help me or fix this or you understand the books and I need someone who can. You got everything you asked for, I said. I made sure of it. I closed the door. Caitlin was at her dad's that weekend, which meant I had the house to myself. I made pasta. I poured a glass of wine. I sat at my kitchen table, my table, in my house, in a life that was entirely of my own construction, and I thought about my grandmother. She kept her own account for 50 years, not secret money, she always said, just hers, something nobody could take. She was the smartest woman I ever knew. The night I finally let myself exhale, really exhale, was an ordinary Tuesday. Caitlin was doing homework at the kitchen table. I was reviewing a client file. She looked up at me at some point and said, completely unprompted, "You know what I want to be when I grow up?" "What?" I said. "Someone who knows what's in the books." I laughed, actually laughed, from somewhere real, for the first time in longer than I could remember. The sage green kitchen in my old house had been repainted grey before I left. I know because I drove past it once, early on, just to close something in myself. Builder grey. Flat and forgettable. I'd spent weeks choosing that color, testing samples in different light, trying to get something that felt like the version of myself I was working toward. In the rental, I painted the kitchen myself. Took a Saturday. Cost $40 in supplies. I chose a warm cream, not quite white, not quite yellow, the color of old paper and good decisions. Caitlin helped me tape the trim. We made it crooked in 3 places and decided we didn't care. It's the best kitchen I've ever had. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the courtroom, not Cole's face when he finally understood what he'd signed. The moment I keep returning to is much smaller than that. It's Caitlin at the kitchen table, helping me tape the trim on a wall that would never be perfectly straight, and neither of us caring. I spent a long time wondering if I'd done the right thing. Not morally. I know what Core did, and I know what I did in response, and I can sit with the difference between those two things. What I questioned was whether the long silence, the 8 months of knowing and saying nothing, had cost me something I couldn't name. Whether patience, taken far enough, starts to hollow you out. I don't think it does. Not if you know why you're waiting. What I really learned, not the lesson you'd print on a motivational poster, but the one that lives in your body, is that integrity isn't about being loud. It's not about fighting every battle the moment it presents itself. Cole operated on the assumption that the person who controls the narrative controls the outcome. He was wrong, but I understand why he believed it. It had worked for him before. What he never accounted for was the possibility that someone quiet could also be someone prepared. I kept my CPA license current for 9 years when I didn't technically need it. I maintained my own accounts throughout our marriage because my grandmother's voice never fully left the back of my head. I documented what I found instead of confronting it emotionally. None of those decisions felt dramatic in the moment. They felt like small, careful choices made by a woman who had decided, at some level she hadn't fully articulated yet, that she was going to stay standing no matter what. That's the part I want Caitlin to understand someday when she's old enough. Not the revenge, not the legal strategy. The part where you do the unglamorous work of knowing your own worth and protecting it, quietly, consistently, even when nobody is watching and nothing about the situation feels fair. Cole had talent. Real talent. I watched him build something from nothing, and I know that wasn't fake. But he confused talent with immunity. He started to believe that the rules that applied to other people didn't quite apply to him, and that the woman managing his books was furniture, not a person with a full interior life and a very good memory. That's the thing about underestimating people. You stop being careful around them. You stop guarding what you should guard. And then one day you find yourself in a courtroom reading a liability clause and realizing you've been talking to someone much more clear-eyed than you gave her credit for. I'm not going to tell you that everything worked out perfectly. The rental house has a bathroom faucet that drips. My client list is still growing. There are Tuesday nights when Caitlin is at her dad's and the house is quiet in a way that takes some getting used to. Life after long marriage is not a clean slate. It's more like a wall you've patched and repainted and decided to call yours anyway. But I painted my kitchen the color I wanted. And when my daughter told me she wanted to grow up to be someone who knows what's in the books, I understood that whatever I'd carried through those 8 months, the stillness, the discipline, the refusal to let fear make my decisions, had already passed to her in some form I couldn't have planned for. That's enough. That's more than enough.